Okay, we are just finished with chapter 1 in the book of Ruth, and we're going to begin at the beginning of 2. But I want to go back just a little bit. So put your attention on verses 19 to 22, and you see where Naomi is when she comes into the second chapter. Now, you have to do a little imagining, to fill the in between the lines of these stories, which is very true of a lot of Bible stories, because the Bible is so succinct and so compressed, but it helps. And I imagine Naomi to be a faithful, believing wife to Elimelech and to God. In other words, Elimelech decides he's going to go, and she goes with him. But why do you think that I would say Naomi is a faithful, believing servant of Yahweh? Anybody? She goes back. Sorry, I can't hear. She returns? Well, she did return, that's right. Because she had an influence on her. She had an influence on Ruth, right? Sure. I think that it was Naomi's quiet, persistent witness that made Ruth come to the point where she could say those wonderful words in chapter 1, whither thou goest, I will go, whither thou lodgest, I will lodge, the things we put in our weddings, beautiful words. Well, she didn't just come up with that at the spur of the moment, did she? So somehow Ruth had come under Naomi's witness, and I think that that had a lot to do with her conversion. Now, I think Naomi objected to the move. I think Naomi's priorities were a bit different. And she and Elimelech had some strong conversations, I'm sure. We do not need to leave Bethlehem. This is our inheritance. This is our place. This is the promised land where God promised to be with us and to bless us. And yes, we are in poverty, and we are in the middle of a drought, and the farm's not doing well, and we need, some help, but this is not the time to leave. And Elimelech says, you got to be kidding. I got to pay the bills. This farm is not producing. Everything's drying up. I'm going into debt. We need to get out of here because we have a financial drain. And so eventually Elimelech made the decision, and they sold the family inheritance to a creditor, got some money, and then they moved to this foreign country, Moab, which, by the way, if you recall, is the country that not long before this, they had been at war with. And after 18 years of serving Moab, Israel won the war, and now Moab serves Israel. So there's a lot of tension between these two countries. And so he goes there, and he says to her, it's only going to be a while. We're going to go for a little while just to get over this tough spot, right? The trouble was, how long did it last? 10 years. Yeah, 10 years. And so I got a feeling as they became sort of planted and laid down roots in this foreign land, that Naomi was very uncomfortable, as you might be, because she saw the partner that her husband went into business with. Now they got money. I mean, the fields of Moab were fertile, and so they managed to get a good income again. They managed to solve their financial problem, but she wasn't sure she liked the kids' friends. And then the kids were going to school, and it bothered her, and she did what she could to counter that. And then the kids started dating, and she's saying, can't you date some good Israelite gals? We can go back and find you a wife like Abraham found a wife for for Isaac. Well, why can't you just marry one of the good old gals in Israel? Well, they fell in love with Moabite women, and contrary to God's law, specifically, they married those ladies. Wasn't much she could do about it, right? And what's she going to do? Well, she does her best to witness to those girls and to help them understand the heritage that they had married into. Teach them about the Lord who had made promises to Abraham and who had brought them up out of Egypt and done the mighty deeds he had done, and then put them in the promised land and made certain promises to them about a redeemer. Now, she was pretty uncomfortable. And they had, I'm thinking, some relief. I mean, there's no question Elimelech made a good business decision, and they were in the fields of Moab, and they wouldn't have stayed there 10 years if it wasn't fairly comfortable. And you can imagine, maybe they bought a piece of land, or now they have a home. They're either renting or they're buying a small home, and things are much better. And so what could Naomi say? She couldn't say, we still got to get back to Bethlehem. And he would have said, are you kidding me? All our friends are here. Our boys have married these families, and these are our family now. We've got good money. We got a good place. Why would you want to go back? No way. No way. And so what happens then is the bottom falls out. Elimelech dies. That means the only income she has is what her sons could provide working the farm. But then her sons die. Now she has no income. In those days, a woman could not gain any income whatsoever except through prostitution. So she's destitute. She has absolutely nothing. And I think she went through any savings they had. I think she sold off the home. I think there was nothing left for her to stay in Moab. And I think she was really justified in being bitter at God. Think about this. She would have said, oh God, what'd you do this to me for? I'm the one who's been trying to reach my daughters-in-law. I'm the one who's been trying to counter all the influence of the pagan culture around us. I'm the one who wants to go back to the promised land. I obeyed my husband. I came. I kept the family together. Aren't you pleased with that? So why did you do this to me? Have you ever asked that question? I did all the right things. I asked you for your will, and I believe you revealed it to me, and I followed you into a difficult place, and I worked harder than I've ever worked before, and now you've made it all fall apart. Why'd you do that to me? I'm bitter. Gigi.
Well, I think it's encouraging because we can't see the whole picture. So she was working and doing these things for the Lord.
Now,
and
your two sentences on the notes ahead of me.
Oh, so sorry.
But you're right. That is exactly what we're going to get to here. I've been through one of those, actually a couple. And one of the best books, if you ever get into a situation like that, would be Philip Yancey's book, Disappointment with God. And I would recommend it to you if you haven't read it before. But then you have to ask the question, why did the Lord do this to his faithful servant, Naomi? Gigi.
Because she couldn't see the whole picture. And he had a plan for Ruth.
Yes.
And for her.
Yeah. Why else? Why would he make life so miserable for her there?
So she'd go home.
To get her to go home. Exactly. He rustled up the nest like an eagle rustles up the nest. Have you ever seen the thing about eagles and their nests? You know, they're made of all these sticks, but they got glass and rocks and everything in the bottom, but they're lined with all these feathers from the mother so that it's nice and soft for the eaglets. And when it's time for the little eaglets to get out of the nest, she stirs it up and throws all those feathers out. Makes it really rough to stay. And that's what God was doing. Yeah.
Isaiah 55:8 says, my thoughts are not your thoughts.
That's true.
My ways are not your ways.
Yeah. Well, she didn't see what God was doing in her life, but that was what it took to get her to move back to Israel and back to himself. And that's where she would find refuge. She would find favor with God and with man, and she would find the redemption that she needed. It often takes God stirring our nest, elevating our pain to get us to come to him. How many times have you witnessed to someone who was wealthy and healthy and everything's going well? How easy it is to witness to somebody like that. I have friends that I've tried to steer, not long ago, just trying to steer the conversation into spiritual direction, and the hand goes up. No way. I'm just not interested. It's good for you, not for me. That's often the case. But when somebody is in this position like Naomi, are they more open to the gospel? Oh, yeah. They know they got a need. They still have a need, rich or poor, but nonetheless, times like that is when God gets us to see it. So she was full of bitterness, disappointment, and anger, and God was doing what he could to move her back. You know, we often think about the parable of the lost sheep. He left the 99, and he went and found the one. And I think we oftentimes think of that poor little lamb out there who is bleating, "Dear shepherd, please come and save me." No. That sheep wouldn't be out there if the sheep wasn't quite comfortable and happy going away from the flock, right? And the only time it's going to start bleating for the shepherd to come get her is when she's caught in the thorns or the thickets or stuck on a ledge and in danger of dying. That's kind of the picture of us. And let me add one other thing. Somebody told me once that if you're a shepherd and you go out to pick up a lost sheep like that, you'd think the sheep would say, "Oh, I'm so glad you came to help me." No, the sheep fights the shepherd, and the shepherd has to knock her down, grab her front legs and back legs, put them up over his shoulders, and she's fighting and squirming and twisting and turning and going, "Bah, bah." And the more you think about that, that is us. We do that very thing, don't we? Yeah, I work on it. I had to work on my my impersonations. Now, I want to ask you one question before we move on from this. Why didn't God do that to Elimelech and the boys? Why didn't things go south to move them back to Israel? Oh, different plan. What was that, Ruth?
Ruth needed a different husband.
Okay, Ruth needed a different husband. Tony? Sovereign grace? Right? Sovereign grace. That's the first answer to that. God is absolutely sovereign. He is righteous and just to save whom he wishes. We are all lost because we are all sinners. But the flip side of that coin is Jesus invites us to come to him. He gives us the option. He doesn't go out and force anyone. He gives us the option. He says it's your choice and it's your responsibility. And I think Elimelech and his boys were quite comfortable in Moab. They had really no desire to go back to Israel. Leonard.
It kind of goes, though, back to what Gigi said, is that Naomi didn't know the plan. God wanted Ruth to come with Naomi, and ultimately God was setting forth a line not only for King David, but ultimately for Jesus Christ.
All of that is true.
So he had a much bigger picture in mind.
All of that is true. My question, though, is why keep Elimelech and the boys out of it?
Simply because they wouldn't have gotten to Ruth.
No, we don't know that. God could have done that a different way. I think you can't escape the question that God did not save Elimelech or his boys. And part of that was his sovereign choice, and the other part was their interest in him. In John chapter 6, verse 37, there's a wonderful balance that Jesus gives. Jack, are you there? Can you read that?
Yes. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away.
You see the two sides? On the one says, all that God has given to me, they are his to give to me. He has chosen them and he will give them to me. They will come. But then he says the other half of that, and whosoever will may come. You see, when we come as unbelievers, that second half is really important. It says, if you will, you may come. And after we have come to God, after we have been saved and converted, and we walk through that archway, we look back and we see chosen in him before the foundation of the world. It's a really difficult thing to understand because God is infinite and he is eternal and we are just little tiny human beings. It takes a certain humility to recognize that. Just wanted to throw that in there. So anyway, what they needed was redemption, refuge, redemption, and favor. And I want to talk about that a little bit. What do you want when you run into severe trials? Do you want a fix or do you want a refuge? And what's the difference? Okay.
All right, so probably initially you want to fix.
You want a fix. I think we all prefer a fix. Lord, this cancer diagnosis, take the cancer away. My wife and I aren't getting along. Fix our marriage. My finances are falling apart. Give me some money. I want that to go away, right? then the other one is a refuge. I want a little bit of a refuge, a shelter in the time of storm. What does God normally give us? He gives us a refuge. Doesn't always take the problem away, does he? When you pray for the Christians in Afghanistan, and I hope you still do, they seem to have been forgotten, don't they? They're still under a lot of pressure. Pray for two things. Pray for avenues of escape. They might have a fix, but pray also for places of refuge because they need it. And that's, of course, what Naomi needs. She needs a place of refuge. Now, what's the difference between a place of refuge and redemption? Is we're going to get this to work today, I hope. Well, let's go back. Oh, gadgets. Don't you love them? All right. And that's not what I want. That's what I want. We're just going to hold. There we go. Okay. Okay. The difference between refuge and redemption. One is short term, as I understand it, and the other one is long term. You see, a refuge is a temporary stop, a shelter in the time of storm along the way. This guy's got a refuge, doesn't he? The storm hasn't gone away. Yeah, unless it breaks down, right? He's got his hands in his pockets. He's kind of looking around, but he doesn't seem to be worried that the storm is raging around him. Do you ever feel like that? We need a place of safety, a shelter in the time of storm from something that threatens to destroy you or give you great pain. And if you look at all the verses about refuge, and it's amazing how many there are in the Bible, it's often paired with shield and help. You are my refuge. You are my shield. You are my help. You're my fortress sometimes. It's to protect us from things that are too big for us. And we all run up against things in life that are too big for us. We need that place of safety. It's also a place where you need some nourishment to get you going, just to keep you from falling apart. And I thought that Matt's the message on the Good Samaritan was great this morning. He talked about how this guy didn't just pray for him and move on his way. He didn't just bandage him up. He took him down to the inn and he made sure he was nourished for a while. You need a little nourishment. Wayside Mission, for example, you get a temporary place where someone can go who's in trouble, find some sustenance. And in finding those things, a refuge also gives you some hope for the future. And those are the things that Naomi needs. She needs some safety. She and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, are walking across the desert alone. They're vulnerable. I mean, that was not, an easy time to travel. There were robbers and bandits everywhere. And so they needed some safety. Even when they got back to Bethlehem, there was a great need for safety because of discrimination and a lot of other things we'll talk about. But then they really need a long-term redemption. We're going to talk a lot about redemption because that's what the book is really about. What does a redemption mean? Mark.
I would say it's restoring to the original owner that which was lost.
Restoring to the original owner that which was lost. It actually comes from the property laws that we're going to be dealing with next week. And it's if you had to sell yourself into slavery, then if you could get the money, you could be redeemed and come out of slavery. If you sold your inheritance, your estate, your farm, well, then you could buy it back, or somebody could buy it back for you. It's the restoring of that which was lost or broken. But there are lots of other things that need to be redeemed. I think, for example, of honor. Rahab, young prostitute in Jericho. She was saved out of that city and she was brought into Israel and she became a great lady in Israel and the mother or the ancestor of one of the greatest kings in Israel. She was redeemed, her honor was redeemed. You think about Hosea and his wife Gomer that he married and she was a prostitute and wound up leaving him and going, and she ended up on the slave block to be sold. And what did he do? He redeemed her. He bought her back. See? In lesser terms, there's redemption of your peace. You see, sometimes we lose our peace. We lose our joy. We lose a lot of things that are involved with our living, independently apart from God, and then God can redeem that and restore those things. So they needed a refuge, at least short term, but they ultimately need a redemption. And I put in that they need favor. You see the word favor throughout the book here, and it's really somebody has to give you favor who has the power to give you refuge and to give you redemption. There's talk about the Kinsman Redeemer in a few minutes, and that's Boaz, of course. And Boaz has the power to redeem their property. If they don't find favor with Boaz, it ain't going to happen. You ever been in business and you needed a loan? You had to find a banker who would show you favor, didn't you? He had to look at you, look at your statements, and he had to say, I'll go ahead and lend you the money. Favor is from somebody, always involves someone. Now, with no reason to stay, plenty of reasons to leave, she heads for home. I think even though Naomi is bitter against God and she blames him for all the bad things that have happened to her, she knows that God is still sovereign, right? She knows that he is still in control, and she is not going to find any blessing in enemy territory. And I think that's true for us. God will not bless us if we insist on living in enemy territory. And so she's returned. We have the same story in the prodigal son. He was sitting there eating the food that they fed to the pigs and hungry as could be. And he finally lifts up his eyes and he says, if I don't return to my father, I'm going to be eating this slop for the rest of my life. So he had to return. I think Naomi must have remembered the words from the Torah that were given from Mount Sinai, where God invites Israel into this special relationship with him. Chapter 19, verse 4 of Exodus. Jack?
You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.
I brought you to myself on eagle's wings. God was telling Israel something. Look, you aren't so smart that you could part the Red Sea, that you could convince Pharaoh to let you go. I brought you here, and I brought you as an eagle brings his young on his back, and I took you to myself. Anybody remember history, I think back in the 1950s or 40s, the Ethiopian Evacuation? Yes. What was the name of that operation? It was Operation Eagle's Wings. And they had some transport planes that in the midst of pogroms that were going on in Ethiopia, Jews who wanted to make Aliyah and go to Israel could get on those planes, and those planes evacuated. It was tremendous. It's a lot like the Berlin airlift. And it's called Operation Eagle's Wings. So I think she knows she needs to return to the place where her Savior is. And I'm sure she understood the metaphor of sheltering under an eagle's wings. In chapter 2, verse 12, you'll see Boaz blesses her and he says, you are a good woman and you have come. May God bless you since you have come to take refuge under his wings. You know, when Brian went to Iraq, what psalm did he put on his helmet? Psalm 91. What does verse 1 and verse 4 say in Psalm 91, Jack?
Verse 1, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Verse 4, he will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart.
You see, that theme goes all through Scripture. Just do a concordance search for refuge, and you will see so much of it. And very often, this idea of being under the wings of God. Now, Elimelech sought refuge from the pressures of financial loss, didn't he? And he found it, but it didn't last. And I think the message there is Naomi went back to the promised land, to the God of her fathers, whose refuge would be permanent and would redeem her. I think now that the fact that she set out to go back was the beginning of her finding a genuine refuge. She hadn't started on the way up yet. She's on the bottom. She's bitter. She's disappointed. She's angry at God. And when that happens, be frank with the Lord. My first big reversal in business, I remember I was so mad at God. And I would scream inside, I was screaming at him. How could you do this to me? I did all the right things. I really identify with Naomi. I was a good boy. I had all the right reasons. I looked to you for guidance and I followed it, and it's your fault. I was bitter. But nothing will change in your bitterness until you return to the God of your salvation. And you go back to the place of his blessing. Nothing will happen until you return. The prodigal son would know no relief until he returned. So, chapter 2, verse 1. Finally in chapter 2. Jack?
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz.
Where'd that come from? I mean, the story's going on, and we have the story about how Elimelech moved and they all lost everything, and Naomi became destitute, and then Ruth agreed to go with her and showed her that hesed love, and then she gets back and she doesn't even notice that Ruth is with her, and she just says, I am miserable. Don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. Call me Mara. She comes back, and now we've heard that story, and immediately it says, however, there was a relative on Elimelech's side. And this is the introduction of a puzzle piece that we won't see where it fits in for a little while. But nonetheless, the author wants us to understand that this guy exists, and he wants us to know a little bit about him. So we have this introduction. And one of the things that it does is it raises a measure of suspense in the reader, doesn't it? Ooh, who's this guy? What could possibly happen with him? Maybe, if he's a kinsman, maybe he could help out. There's some hope. And as the story proceeds, there's a bunch of dramatic irony. What is dramatic irony? In a story, like in a movie. You know something that the participants don't know. And we don't know that Ruth knew anything at all about Boaz. This is the narrator, probably writing from David's time, about a couple hundred years earlier. He's telling the story, and he just says, there's this guy. But let's take a look at what this says about him. He says, he is a man of standing, sometimes translated a worthy man. The Hebrew is Gibor Hayil. Now, if you remember back in Genesis, there was the Giborim. That's the plural of Gibor. And those were the mighty men that were descended from the Nephilim, the angels and human beings had these enormously powerful beings that were called Gibborim, translated heroes of old, mighty men, giants. So in one sense, this idea of a Gibbor or a man of standing is he's powerful. He's powerful, and especially in the military sense. It's also that it means he's capable. And it's used in 1 Kings of Jeroboam. Solomon says, I'm going to put Jeroboam in charge of the whole construction project on the walls because he is so capable. He knows what he's doing and he can make things happen. So he's a capable man. Also, he's a man of high social standing. Same word used of Kish. And you know who Kish's son was Saul. Saul, son of Kish, right? And the family of Kish was very, very highly regarded in Israel. So he's a man of high social status. And then he's a wealthy man. In 2 Kings 15, when Assyria was threatening Israel, they oftentimes had to pay ransom or tribute. And they would raise that tribute from the Gibor Hayil in the country. All the wealthy men would have to pony up their money and keep Assyrian armies out of their country. So they had to be very wealthy. So he's a powerful man, a capable man, a man of high social status, and a wealthy man. What we don't know is he a good man? And is there any hope for this man? To be this kind of a Gibor Hayil. There are lots of men that are big cheeses, but they're not good men. And they're not the kind of men that we need for refuge and for redemption. Well, the second thing it says about him is he is a kinsman. And the Hebrew for that is goel. Goel. And that is all, that whole idea of goel is what makes up the law of inheritance. First thing is he's a member of the clan of Elimelech. Now, that doesn't mean he's a cousin or an uncle. He could be a long way off, but he is in the clan. Now, you had in Israel, you had the nation of Israel, it was all 12 tribes. You had the tribe, and then you had the family, and in between those two was the clan. And the job of the clan, that was the most important tribal grouping, was to maintain the inheritances of its members. Because all of Israel's all about the land, Israel's all about the promised land. God has given each tribe its portion. And then remember, each tribe took to the clans and it divided up the inheritance down to the individual farm. And you were nobody apart from your inheritance. It's a lot different from us. We don't see ourselves as just receivers of an inheritance. We go out there and in business and the economy, and we make our way. We're individualists, but not so in most parts of the world. If your family has a farm, inheriting that farm and having someone to inherit it and keep it in the family was extremely important. And it says he is a possible redeemer. Now we're getting the word redeemer. Now, the principle comes from Mosaic law in Leviticus, and it concerns somebody who had to sell his property, like Elimelech, to a creditor. And how do you preserve his inheritance? Leviticus 25:25. Yeah.
If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold.
Okay. Now, if you go a little further in that passage, and if there's nobody to redeem it for them, but then later on they prosper, they can buy it back. Okay. And in any event, it would revert back to the owner at the year of Jubilee. What was the year of Jubilee? 50 years. Every 50 years, there was a Sabbath year called the year of Jubilee, and everything returned to its owner. So if you bought a piece of property from somebody, all right, the price was determined by how many years were left until Jubilee. Because at Jubilee, you're going to lose it.
That's called remainder of an interest.
Remainder, all right, say that again.
Remainderment interest.
Remainderment interest. There you go. That's what you call it. That's true in a lot of places. I think Hawaii is like that. There's a 100-year lease on a lot of the properties in Hawaii. So you don't own your property. You own the lease on your property, and its value changes. So if the fortunes of the man, let's say Elimelech, were restored, he could buy his land back. Now it appears if he couldn't buy it back, and it was still a long way to Jubilee, well then his nearest relative has a duty, if he's able and willing, to buy it for him, give him back his inheritance. It's called the Kinsman Redeemer. Now, this is not levy rate marriage. That's a different law. A lot of people start confusing the two, although they seem to be combined a bit in Ruth. But the idea of a goel is only about property, not about raising up offspring. Now, this is the narrator's observation. We don't know that Ruth had a clue who this person was. We don't know that Naomi had any reason to expect help from this relative. This relative is, he's a big rich guy, and somewhere in back we knew him. I was trying to think of a way to communicate that, and I thought I would tell you about my dad. I am related to Charles Lindbergh.
Fly away.
Fly away, yeah. See? I knew all my interest in aviation was because of that. No, actually, my dad's family is distantly related. And in fact, when Lindbergh had his return from Paris, remember he made the first solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, and he became a celebrity and a major player in the United States. They had a big ticker tape parade. And this is it. Look at the cuties there. 1927. This is Dad on the left. And he was related to him such that they got to sit in the bleachers that were reserved for family members. Okay. And I'll show you in just a second. Let's see there. I think that it's either that one or this one over here. And that would be where Dad and his family sat. And Carol Ann never knew this. When I was telling her this when I was doing the lesson, and she said, give me a magnifying glass. And she's looking for Granddad. Where is he? He's up there somewhere. Oh, but yeah.
He would have been in a suit.
He would have been in a suit. That's right. Now, I don't think that my dad or his father had any claim on Lindbergh and could go to him and ask him for financial help. But that's kind of where Naomi is in this situation. She has a distant relative who's famous, powerful, capable, and very wealthy. It would be nice if we could get some help from there. Now, let's go to chapter 2, verse 2.
And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter.
Well, now you notice who's depressed. Naomi is depressed, yeah. So the person who takes action to help out in this situation is not Naomi, it's Ruth. In fact, the actual literal translation of this is, I am going to the fields. Now remember, she's young. I'm thinking she's in her early to mid 20s. May have gotten married in her teens, typical. And she's going out on her own, unaccompanied, into the fields. Okay? Most mothers wouldn't want that to happen in those days. And Ruth says, I'm going. I'm going. And I'm going to see if I can find favor in somebody who would allow me to glean in their field. Now, you got to understand a little bit about the laws of gleaning. The fields would be outside the village, and they would have markers on them that would mark out sections, and you would own one or more sections. We assume Boaz had a bunch of them, okay? And then those were yours to farm, all right? Leviticus 19, verse 9, Jack.
When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest.
You can see the rest of that is right here. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. How about Deuteronomy 24:19?
When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it again for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands.
Now, I had a chance to go to India a few years ago, and it was, what do we get? Somebody's it's going, yeah. Okay. I had a chance to go to India, and it was harvest time, and this is how they harvested. The men go out in the field, okay, and with their hands, they grab a bunch of stalks of the wheat or the grain, and they have a sickle in their other hand, and they chop it off at the bottom. And then when they get enough under their arm, they lay it down in a pile, and they keep right on moving. And then behind them, the women come, and they gather these up, and they'll either bind them in bundles or little teepees, you know, like sheaves. And then eventually they will carry them over to the threshing floor, which might be very close, or to a cart, which takes it to the threshing floor. Then another crew takes that wheat or grain, and it lays it out on the floor, beats it like crazy, and then throws it up in the wind to separate the wheat, the grain from the straw and the chaff, okay? And the straw is generally piled in hay bales for the winter, for fodder, for bedding, and the grain, of course, is put in bags, and those bags would be put over at the side of the threshing floor. It's interesting that Boaz slept on the threshing floor. What was he doing? Protecting his property. That's right. He said he was right by the grain. And so that's how this whole thing works. And the idea was that the poor and the foreigners were allowed to pick up the leftovers. And Israel was ordered by God, be considerate. Don't go back over your fields a second time. Don't pick up the grapes that fell. Leave that for the poor.
You know, they still do that in Israel today.
Is that right?
Yeah. I was talking to Dan Price and they were taking a tour and someone asked why they didn't harvest all the way to the edge and nobody knew. And Dan had to tell them, well, here's why you're doing it.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Oh, that's cool. Okay. Well, now you got to realize the reapers are being hired by the owner. And the owner does not want them to be inefficient. So they're going to get everything they can on the first shot, right? And so there wouldn't be a lot left over. And really, gleaning was a lot like going out after aluminum cans by the side of the road today. Same sort of thing. Now, the interesting thing is Ruth needed to get permission. It says, I want to pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. She needs favor, right? She needs favor. She needs permission. If she's going to find a refuge of sustenance to feed her, she needs some favor. Now, I want you to know something. She showed great courage to do this. I mean, we think of, Ruth said she's going to go glean in the field. She goes over to this field where Boaz is, and she does her thing, and they have this wonderful romance. And we forget it was tough to do that. She may have gone from one field to the next, asking the foreman, can I glean in your field? I think she ran a gauntlet of molestation. There would have been, these are young men full of testosterone. Then a single unaccompanied girl who was poor was fair game. That's still true in a lot of places in this world. And so she may have been pushed around. She may have been abused. She may have been kicked off the land by the foreman. They might have said, you Moabites, we don't want your kind here. And so she had to be pretty courageous to go out in the middle of that and do this. But the other thing I want you to see is she was persistent. Now look at verse 7. Okay. She says, the overseer is reciting this to Boaz later. She says, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, we all think that she came and she started gleaning behind and she worked hard, and that was noteworthy. But there's more to it than that. It's more likely to be translated this way. She came and has stood waiting here from early morning till now. The field has been her residence and the shelter has meant little to her. You see, that shows that she's a determined woman. This is one field she hasn't been thrown off of. The foreman hasn't let her glean yet. He hasn't given her access to the property, but I think the foreman knows who he's working for. And rather than go ahead and allow this Moabite to come in on his fields, he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to kick you off. We'll wait till the boss comes. When he comes, he'll answer the question. And so she has to stand there, and she's standing there. I'm waiting. Boss here yet? Don't forget me. She's a persistent girl. I've learned one thing about Ruth in this study. She was not a shrinking violet. She was a tough gal who had a good idea of what she wanted and where she wanted to be and go. And she was not easily deterred. Anyway, she showed patience, she showed determination, but she also showed some respect for the customs of the people. Oh, that's the translation right here. She came and stood here waiting from early morning till now. Now, in her desperate need to find refuge, verse 3. Jack?
So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech.
Oh, that's where the picture puzzle fits. That's this guy we learned about back here. And as it just so happens, she winds up in this field. As chance would have it, some translations say, she ends up in the field. And I think the author is being tongue-in-cheek, isn't he? He's saying, well, what do you know about that? See, God's activity is not clear and open in this story, as it is in a couple other books, but there's no prophets, no visions, none of that. But he is behind the scenes in everything. He's in charge of the just so happens of our lives. I love that old song. If his eye is on the sparrow, I know he watches me. There is no chance in the Christian's life. When you wake up on a Friday morning, you realize it's the 13th. Does that ever bother you? Have you ever suddenly said, oh my, Friday the 13th, and then say, oh, that's ridiculous. Of course it is. You know, I'll look at the calendar, see Friday the 13th. Well, a lot of people think that's unlucky. It doesn't matter. I have no such thing as luck in my life. My Friday is in God's hands, and so is yours. My COVID is in God's hands. So is yours. Anyway, so all of a sudden, here's this guy Boaz shows up. He can provide food, he can provide protection, and we get all this additional hope that maybe there's more to it than that. Now, Ruth needs more than just food and protection from the bad guys on the field. And he does provide that. She needs some long-term security. And Naomi needs somehow to get her inheritance back. So we're left in this situation saying, do we dare hope? And so before he tells us how that happens, the narrator tells us what kind of character this big cheese, this worthy man is. And remember that he is also an image of the Lord Jesus. He's a worthy man. Verse 4, I'm not going to read the whole story. I'll let you read it. It's such an easy read. But he comes from Bethlehem, and how does he greet the harvesters? The Lord, Yahweh, bless you. And the harvesters dance him. The Lord bless you. You see, this is at the period of time when Israel was descending into pagan Baal worship. But for some reason, there's an island here in Bethlehem. It's early in the period of the Judges, and there are still those who fear the Lord. Still those who greet one another that way. You know, when I lived in Germany as a kid, the old folks would always greet one another, Grüß Gott, greetings from God. You never hear that anymore. And we certainly don't hear it. So anyway, so he's one who fears the Lord, okay? He notices the poor woman waiting in the field. It says in verse 5, he says, who does that woman belong to? Now, some people think that this is a matter of love. No, I think Boaz is just a man who is kind and cares about the little guy. He is charitable. And he notices this woman's waiting over there. And he wants to know what it's all about. Well, he sees the unseen ones. You know, he talks to his foreman when he comes. And you'd think the first thing he'd say to him is, how's it going today? What's the production rate? How many bags have we got over there on the threshing floor? And, you know, you got enough laborers? Anything having to do with business, but he doesn't. As far as we know, he starts out by saying, who's that lady over there?
Probably didn't hurt that she was pretty.
We don't know that. I think that's true, but I have reasons later on to think so. But it doesn't mention it. And the Bible's not at all shy about telling women that are beautiful, talking about beautiful women. Sarah is the only one in the Bible who's called very beautiful. I'm eager to meet her. But
She's taken.
you're taken, right? So now remember, he notices this woman. And we've been talking about that in Kyle's messages, haven't we? Compare that to the women in chapter 1. In kind of talking to Naomi, they don't even acknowledge that this Moabite exists. Naomi herself doesn't introduce her. There's no mention of Ruth at all. She's a non-person. But Boaz notices. In Genesis chapter 20, Sarah has driven her slave Hagar out into the desert. And Hagar is stopped by a tree, and God appears to her and tells her to go back, tells her son will be the father of great nations, that'd be the Arabs, and tells her to go back and serve her mistress again. And she does something interesting. She names God. And it's the first time that the word El Roi is applied to God. And it means the one who sees me. So his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And in verse 10, Ruth is pretty surprised. She says, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner? In verses 8 and 9, he speaks kindly to her. He calls her my daughter. So she even acknowledges later on, she says, you have put me at ease. And then he invites her to sit down in 14:16. Go ahead, let's read that one, Jack.
At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over.
Okay, he invites her to sit down.
I'm sorry, you asked me to read all the way to 16.
All to 16, yep.
I quit early.
Oh, all right.
As she went up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her.
So he invites her to sit down. Now, an invitation to a meal, what does that mean? You are one of us. She goes from being the foreigner, the poor, destitute, beggar. Now she's part of the crew. He has invited her to sit down. He provides her with food, and she eats till she's full, probably the first full meal she's had. You ever read stories about people who've been POWs in prisoner camps and they have been wasted away till they're 90 pounds and so forth. And once they're out and they're taken, let's say, to a military base and they're fed and they can eat all they want. What do? Well, they take and they put it in their pockets, don't they? And if you were to stay with them for a while, you would find that food, crackers and ketchup things and whatever would be stuck underneath the mattress. She's hungry. And she knows that Naomi's hungry too. And so she stuffs it into her pocket even after she's full. In verse 9, it gives her access to the water cart, probably the most important thing in that arid climate. And then he arranges to ease her burden of labor. He gives her access among the sheaves. Now remember, they cut the wheat, they lay it down, it's bundled up into sheaves and left there until somebody can pick it up and take it to the threshing floor. And I presume that the foreigners and the poor were not allowed to glean until that process was over. So in other words, the women had bound up the sheaves, they'd picked them up, put them on the cart, or they'd taken them off to the threshing floor, and then they moved on to the next part of the field. So now you guys can go ahead and pick up what's left over. And he says, let her glean among the sheaves. There'll be a lot more there for her. Go ahead and let her go there. She gets first shot at it. He also tells the reapers, he said, be a little sloppy. This gal's a poor gal. He knew, it turns out, that she was Naomi's daughter-in-law and what she had done for Naomi and how she was actually coming to this gleaning in order to support Naomi. And so he's really got a lot of compassion for this poor woman. And he says, be a little sloppy for her sake. Now, you got to make the comparison to Jesus, because Boaz is an image of our Redeemer. See, and we'll see that as more and more as we go along. He sees the unseen. He speaks kindly to us. He invites us in. He eases our burden and he gives us rest. The most beautiful verse in the Bible is Matthew 11:28. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke, my labor upon you, and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. And you will find rest for your souls, because my yoke's easy. My burden's light. Jesus, like Boaz, invites us in. He makes us one of his crew, one of his family, and he eases our burden. And then he also provides refuge. She now is protected. She is nourished. Remember, we talked about what refuge means. She is protected and she is nourished. And Boaz, like Christ, welcomes us and gives us refuge. There's one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 37. It has a lot of good passages in it, but at the very, very end, it says, the salvation of the righteous comes from the Lord. He is their stronghold in time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them. And this is always bold and underlined, because they take refuge in him. Because they're so smart, because they're holy and good, because they accomplish great things for his name? No, because they simply seek refuge in him. They come to the field and they ask his favor. May I glean in your field? And that is you and me. We are lost. We are born and raised on death row. We are poor and desperately in need of his safety, his protection, and his nourishment. Boaz is a great example of that, and he accepts us simply because we take our refuge. And we just got to look at Boaz's response. Chapter 2, verses 10 and then verse 13, Jack.
At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls.
She is amazed. Wow. Wow. She shows humility. She shows an honest assessment of her condition. She's not making demands. She's not saying, hey, look, Moses' law requires you let me glean here. No. She says, why should you even notice me, a foreigner? You have set me at ease by your kindness. And she wants this favor to continue. I love Casting Crowns song. The lyric goes, who am I that the Lord of all the earth would care to know my name, would care to feel my hurt? Boaz represents to us the Lord Jesus. And that's the proper approach of the sinner. Who am I, Lord, that you should forgive me, that you should be incarnate in Christ and die and take on yourself the punishment for my sin? What right do I have? And the answer is none. We're back to sovereign grace, God's grace. Boaz tells us why in verse 11 and 12. Jack?
Boaz replied, I've been told all about you, all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
Yeah, Hesed begets Hesed. Remember, Hesed is steadfast love and care. It includes, I think, grace. Grace begets grace. The steadfast love and loyalty begets steadfast love and loyalty. It's the principle of sowing and reaping. Ruth to Naomi, she shows Hesed time and again. Boaz to Ruth, and of course the Lord to Ruth and Boaz combined and to his people. God has shown us his Hesed. And then Boaz recognizes a limitation we have to recognize. He recognizes his own kindness is not enough, but rather he refers her to Yahweh, to Jehovah, to God, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. We can't fix all the problems in the world. We can't even fix all the problems of one person necessarily. Social programs can't feed the hungry. All our good works, even, let me add to that, even our showing love to people one at a time. There are limits to what we can accomplish unless God himself does a work in a person's life. Psalm 37:25 says this, I was young and now I'm old. I identify with that verse more and more. I was young and now I'm old, but never have I seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread. And I can say that's true. And I think you can too. And then Boaz was under no obligation to give her that. She ate until she was full. Her gleanings were way above what must have been expected. If you go ahead and read verses 17 and 18, you'll see that she did her own threshing. She got the grain into a bag or into her shawl, and she had about an ephah. Now, an ephah is about 30 pounds. You know, I mean, I get a 40-pound bag of sacrete. That's a hefty piece of weight. She's taking this thing, puts it over her shoulder, takes it home to Naomi. Naomi can't believe it. What abundance. This wasn't a free handout. It was a fruit of her labor made possible by Boaz. And he didn't just give her charity, he gave her abundance. And in that, he shows God's abundant grace and favor. Remember, grace, which is how we are saved, is unmerited. What's the definition of grace? Unmerited favor from God. We don't deserve it. He abundantly provides for us much more than we deserve. And I love the parables. For example, Luke chapter 19, the parable of the minas. He says, he gives a guy 1 mina, the guy comes back, gives him back an increase. And he says, oh, you've been faithful with 1 mina, here, rule 10 cities. You say, whoa, what is that? God's reward is abundant. His refuge will hold us temporarily, but ultimately his redemption will bring us more good than we ever would think of. It says, eye is not seen, ear is not heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him. As you're getting older, do you start thinking about what's glory like? What will it be like when I pass that door? It's coming up, right? And when it opens, what'll be there? I have no idea, except for one thing. Jesus will be there. He is the one who knows my name. He knows who I am. He knows my heart. He cares about my hurt. He has reached down and he has saved me with his abundant grace. And whatever it is, it's up there. And I don't even know what it means to see in heaven. But whatever it is, it's abundant. He says, I have come that they might have a life, they might have it abundantly. And I want to end with one last thing. We're a couple minutes over. Chapter 2, verse 20. It says something interesting. Naomi sees what's happened. And she says, oh my goodness, the Lord bless this man. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Now, who's the he? No. No, it's not Boaz. The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Is that a change in Naomi's heart? Up to now, it's been, he's beat me up. God's been cruel to me. He has messed up my life. Now he says, the Lord bless that man. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. I think that this is the point where Naomi begins to pull out of a dive. She begins to come back and recognize that God is working. It's such a contrast. You can see how the grace or the hesed shown by one man has opened the eyes of the one who receives it to what God has done. Jesus said in Matthew 5, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father, which is in heaven. We'll pick up the romantic part next week.